Here we are again, back at the refurbished glass-fronted bookcase. This time we're going to be digging for the very first horror fiction I ever read. It actually starts here at the First Methodist Church in Westbury, New York. I was in junior high, 7th or 8th grade, I'm not sure, probably 7th grade. And I was at one of those fall festival fairs where, you can buy all sorts of knickknacks and jellies and quilts and stuff, but they also sold a bunch of used books. And one of the books I found there that caught my eye was something called Boris Karloff's Favorite Horror Stories, probably because it had a picture of him on the cover. And on the inside I saw that it would only cost me 10 cents. So I thought, well, if it's good enough for Boris, maybe it's good enough for me. And here it is. What a book it turned out to be. You can see 10 cents worth. What was in this book, what a dime got me, was an introduction to, I'm going to read from here because the table of contents just says the names of the stories. What it introduced me to was Frank Gruber's The 13th Floor, Edmund Hamilton's Child of the Winds, John Jake's The Opener of the Crypt, August Derleth's The Thing That Walked on the Wind, this very famous one by Evan Hunter, The Scarlet King. That story still creeps me out. And Theodore Sturgeon, Ted Sturgeon, who up to this point I only knew as a science fiction writer, and a great science fiction writer. He's here with a story called The Graveyard Reader. Excellent, excellent story. And then the story that literally changed my life as far as appreciating what quality horror is was C.M. Kornbluth's The Mind Worm. Probably the best vampire story I have ever read. Right there. Robert Silverberg. Again, I only knew him as a science fiction writer. He's here with Back from the Grave. Even got some Roald Dahl, Man from the South. Early Robert Bloch, before Psycho, well before Psycho. The Opener of the Way, that's back when he was an acolyte of H.P. Lovecraft. And speaking of Lovecraft, my very first introduction to H.P. Lovecraft, it had to be The Haunter of the Dark. Still my favorite Lovecraft story. Scares the hell out of me every time. This is about the way I found it in this condition. Somebody had drawn on Boris's face, but this is the book that introduced me to modern at this point in time, the 1960s, horror. I'd read a couple of Edgar Allan Poe stories in school, but this was it. You can tell it's the 60s because the weird, the wonderful, and the way out. Well, having discovered Lovecraft, I wanted to find more. So I also discovered a publisher called Arkham House out of Sauk City, Wisconsin. And they were supposedly the best source for the best versions of Lovecraft's work. So I spent the money that I was making at that time as a stock boy at the local A&P, $1.34 an hour, afternoons and weekends. And I bought this, a hardcover called The Dunwich Horror and Others. And it had The Haunter of the Dark in it. So I knew I was in for a treat, and I certainly was. There were other books, though, that Arkham House was selling. This one is dated 1963. The next one I got was the novels, the long pieces, At the Mountains of Madness and Other Novels. Sorry for this. I had no idea I was writing in expensive, rare books at the time. Again, Arkham House, Sauk City. This one from 1964. And I was, of course, introduced to the title story, as well as The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Shunned House, The Dreams in the Witch House, which is very, very well done. And the Dream Quest story, The Silver Key and the Other Silver Key, not so much. I wasn't done. There were more books to buy. The Lesser Stories, Dagon or Dagon, and Other Macabre Tales. This one dated 1965. There's some good ones in here. You know, like, who am I to say? The Horror at Red Hook, I appreciated it a lot. For example, The Lurking Fear was cool. The Hound, I like The Hound. And finally, from 1966, I think. Yeah. The Dark Brotherhood and Other Pieces by Lovecraft and some other people. August Derleth put this together. He threw in one of the stories that he co-wrote. Other people, C.M. Eddy. Some photographs, which I thought were interesting. Some of the history of early illustration. Clark Ashton Smith. Early Virgil Finlay, The Shunned House. Interesting book. Well worth searching out. So, with the Boris Karloff collection and these, I figured I was well on my way in reading horror. In 1970, thereabout, I was a sophomore in high school, I sent away for a mail order catalog from a bookseller in New Jersey. His name was Jerry De La Rue. And he mailed me back this long list of used books, rare books, all genre books, science fiction, horror, fantasy, things like that. And there was a book on that list of stories, a story collection from a writer named Fritz Leiber Jr., and the book was called Night's Black Agents, and it was a first edition 1947 Arkham House hardcover with a dust jacket. And Mr. De La Rue wanted $17.50 for it. I knew about Fritz Leiber through some magazine stories I'd read that he'd had published, and I said, I'm going to give this guy a shot. So I sent away for that book. In that same list, by the way, there was another book, another Arkham House first edition story collection by another writer named Ray Bradbury, who I really liked, but I only knew him as a science fiction writer. But this is a book called Dark Carnival. Mr. De La Rue wanted $49 for that, and that was just beyond my means, so I passed that one by. Should not have passed that by. Anyway, I got a first edition of Night's Black Agents, which had several wonderful horror short stories and two of his Fafford and the Graham Hauser stories as well. I ended up having to sell that book about 20 years later, in order to pay some household bills. So I sold it to another book collector, which I regret, but bills had to be paid. However, recently I was able to pick up a British edition. When was this from? It doesn't say. But at some point in the 70s or 80s. And this is an exact duplicate of the book, the original book, with the exception of this. So at least I still have the stories. This is a wonderful collection, especially my favorite is The Hill and the Hole, which ended up being the inspiration for my first novel, The Boneworms. I don't think I would ever have come up with the idea for The Boneyard if I hadn't read that story. Speaking of Bradbury, again, like I said, I had known him mainly as a science fiction writer through some stories I read in school. Of course, I read all the usual suspects, Martian Chronicles, Illustrated Man, Machineries of Joy, all of those. Had them all in paperback. Bantam was putting them out in uniform editions in paperback. But then I saw this, The October Country. And I picked it up and I started reading it, and I realized that this was, it says it right here, this was a modern reimagining of Dark Carnival. So I had missed that original Dark Carnival, but here was most all of the stories that were in that book, plus a few more. And at the time, I remember I actually put stars next to the ones I really liked, like Skeleton got 2, The Emissary only got 2. That would get 5 now, because that's my favorite story here at this point in my life. I love that last line, Martin had company. Love that. For some reason I gave Touched with Fire 3. I doubt I'd give that one 1 now. And here we go, The Man Upstairs. I wrote absolute best. it still holds up. Very, very creepy story. Very creepy. These were all stories that apparently Bradbury wrote in the early and mid 1940s when he had moved out to LA. And they were published mainly in Weird Tales. And some of these later ones here, like The Wonderful Death of Dudley Stone and Homecoming and The Next in Line, I think, they were published later in places like Mademoiselle. But as an introduction to, again, modern at that time, in 1970, this was invaluable to me, these stories, and just gave me an even greater respect for Bradbury the writer. Finally, for this video, we have this, Black Easter by James Blish. I had only known Blish when I was a kid as the writer who wrote the story versions of the first couple of seasons episodes of Star Trek. The William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy Star Trek. I like them a lot. I like them because they mainly followed the TV episodes. He even made them better. So in my mind, he was a science fiction writer for hire, kind of. But then one day I was walking down the aisle in the town library in Westbury, New York, and I saw this. This is actually a library copy, a withdrawn library copy that I bought recently through AB Books or ABE Books. This is exactly the book, not the book, but an exact same copy of the book that I found in the Westbury Public Library. I saw Black Easter, James Blish. So I pulled it out and I looked at it and I said, well, this certainly isn't a Star Trek novel. And then I opened it up and there was an author's note, sort of a disclaimer, like, buyer beware, or don't do this, kind of a warning. He was taking the information he was giving us in this book, a work of fiction, as being real. Mainly it's about grimoires or spells to summon demons. And he didn't want anybody to unintentionally, using his book, summon a demon. This also has what remains for me the book that has the best first line ever. And I'll read it right here. The room stank of demons. Sold. Took this home. I think I read it in one night. This book also has what I consider to be one of the greatest last lines of any book I've ever read, but I'm not gonna tell you that. That would kind of give it away. But this was a game changer for me. A serious literary novel about white and black witchcraft that just felt so real. Love this book. This is actually the second book of a trilogy. Blish wrote a book before this, I think it was called A Case of Conscience, which is straight science fiction. This is not science fiction. And there was one other one after this, I forget the name of it. Well, it's not here because, oh, here it is. This novel completes a trilogy with the all-over title of After Such Knowledge. The previous volumes, which are independent of each other, except for subject matter, are Dr. Mirabilis and A Case of Conscience. Okay, so this is book 3. Case of Conscience was book 2, and Dr. Mirabilis was book 1. I've read A Case of Conscience, but I haven't read Dr. Mirabilis. I'll have to give that a try. Highly, highly recommended. Can't say it enough.